You're listening to the Bear in Mind podcast, episode 105.
A podcast uncovering identity, color, and love, where driving yourself crazy is totally sane and curable. Now your host, T. Bias.
I'm so excited to be talking about verbal judo. So every episode that ends in 5, I am going to be talking about verbal judo around a specific type of conversation that you commonly have with friends and family members. And today we're going to be talking about unsolicited advice. And I want to give you a little background on why I'm doing verbal judo. It's, first of all, communication. If you want to communicate the way you want to communicate in your relationships, and you want to kind of break a pattern of not saying things you don't mean or yelling or learning how to respond to things that you don't like to hear, it is all about emotional health. It's about understanding your emotions, dealing with your emotions, processing your emotions, and then any way that you want to communicate to somebody, you will be able to figure that out. So that is kind of the basis. But while you're trying to break some of your patterns and try to show up in your relationships the way you want to, it's sometimes nice to have some actionable tips. And that's why I'm doing verbal judo, because when I was trying to figure out what was happening in my relationships and why people were saying things to me and I didn't like that they were saying them, I wanted to respond in a way that was, one, kind to them, but also kind to myself, and still hold boundaries. And there are so many different types of conversations out there where I think verbal judo comes into play. And so today is about unsolicited advice. And unsolicited advice is when you don't ask for advice and somebody gives it to you anyway. And there's the other part of unsolicited advice that happens to me where I share my story and it's not a problem. So I'm not discussing my situation as how I see it. I don't see it as a problem. And the other person gives me advice anyway. So I actually think there's two types of unsolicited advice. You can very well share your problem and not want the advice. And the basis of verbal judo is I'm always going to connect it back to emotional health. The reason why we don't like unsolicited advice is simply because we don't think that the person should be giving it, or because we didn't intend to solicit the advice. We communicated our story. We communicated maybe a problem. And that was not our intention in sharing our story with our friend or family member. And so the biggest hurdle in that is thinking that people shouldn't give unsolicited advice, because guess what? People do it, and you can't control other people. And it's still going to happen, and you're still going to be in situations where people are freely going to give their advice. And I'm also giving you advice on this, although I hope it's solicited if you click to play. So that's kind of like the root cause of the problem. So we can't control them. Solicited advice is going to happen. And when you accept that, you can definitely find a way that you want to respond to it. And I'm just going to give you one way. This is my way of responding to unsolicited advice, with the understanding your emotions behind it, so that whenever something comes up, no matter what the person says, you will be able to respond in a way that you want to, that the way you intentionally want to. So I have 4 steps, and I will put a link in the show notes to the specific blog article that I wrote on the 4 steps. So if you're listening to this and you're on your way commuting somewhere, don't worry, it's on the website for you to refer back to it. So number 1 is to let go of the intentions. Now, a lot of times, I think the common advice that I've been reading on the internet about unsolicited advice is that we need to see it from a good intention, like the person's giving us advice because they want to help us. And a lot of times that intention is not really true, and oftentimes we don't even know our own intentions. And also, some of the intentions that I read is like, oh, well, a lot of times who give unsolicited advice is they're trying to control the situation. Well, whether it's coming from a good or bad intention, you actually don't know, and you can drive yourself crazy. Because even when you ask somebody, what did you mean, or why are you doing that? Because that's how you try to understand somebody's intention, is why did you do that, or why did you say that? we don't even know our own intentions. Until we can get really mindful and understand our emotions, we often can trick ourselves into believing we're doing something from a good place, when really there's an underlying thought and emotion driving some of the behaviors. So let go of your intention. If your intention was to tell your story and not get advice, let go of the other person's intention. And this is often a very difficult step. That number one step is simple, right? Let go of the intentions. It's often the hardest for myself. It was hard for me to get over. And when I've talked to other people about it, it is really difficult to overcome. The second thing is to separate acknowledgement and action. So whenever somebody gives us advice, it's like we forget that we can acknowledge it without thinking that, well, I don't need to act on it. I don't need to take the advice. I don't even need to consider the advice. The two are separate. You can acknowledge what somebody said and the fact that they're sharing their story without even considering their advice. And I do this all the time, and I actually did this in my book club. I am always open to reading books, and I will read any book in book club. But when it comes to my personal reading and someone giving me suggestions, I don't like it because I didn't ask you. I never ask. And then in my book club, people always tell me what I should be reading. And so this is what I said to them. And this was literally yesterday at my book club. I said, I appreciate you sharing that. That's all I said. So you can acknowledge that somebody gave you that advice. You can acknowledge, you can say, thank you for sharing that. Oh, wow, you know a lot about this subject. Acknowledge it, and then you don't have to consider it. You don't have to do it. You don't have to act on it. And what I really want you to do, and this goes into step number 3, is to acknowledge a positive element of it. And acknowledgement doesn't mean you say, oh, okay, that's advice. It is really trying to acknowledge a positive element of that. And it's not about really the other person. It's for you to see that in a conversation, it is about being gentle to the other person and gentle to yourself. Because if you're looking at what the other person says with such a negative lens, it's going to be very difficult to continue to have conversations with that person if you're constantly coming with that negative lens to anything that they say, even when they give you that advice. So it can easily just be, I appreciate you sharing your story. That's it. They shared their story and you can appreciate that. And it isn't that, oh, wow, that's great advice or that's a great idea. You don't have to go that far, and you don't need to lie. You don't need to say, I'm going to consider it or anything like that. Because when it comes to verbal judo, I'll tell you what, the biggest thing is keeping it honest. I believe you can find some positive element, even if it's, I appreciate you sharing. That's it. And this goes into step number 4 is lose the need to explain your decision immediately. So we often think like, oh, we need to tell them if you're going to consider it or you're not going to consider it. And even when we're not going to consider it, we need to tell them, well, I don't actually like your idea. My idea is better. And this has come up in a lot of discussions when it comes to when family members give advice on how to raise children, maybe like grandparents give advice to the parents, like, oh, you should spank your children. And that would keep them in line. And then you're like, I'm not spanking them. I'm not yelling at them. I'm doing this. This is a very personal, real example. And we often come to the notion that even if we've already made a decision about if we're going to take the advice or not, that we need to somehow communicate that. You don't need to. Even if you're going to do something else, you don't even need to communicate that you're doing something else. You can still acknowledge it and not follow it. You can still acknowledge it and not tell them your decision about how it is you're going to handle a problem if you're talking about a problem. And this is, I think, a lot of times very tricky. It's probably the second hardest part, is to keep yourself from sharing that decision with the person. I don't share the decision anymore with my person. And I usually only do that if I 100% agree with somebody. And even then, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. I acknowledge that it's a great idea. But even then, I'm not saying, oh, I'm going to follow that or I'm going to do that, even if maybe I am going to do that. I'll go through the 4 steps, and there's no need to worry. If you go to the show notes, there'll be a link to the blog article, and it's even also, I created a pin on Pinterest with all the 4 steps. So here they are again. Number 1, let go of the intention, your intention in telling your story and their intention for giving the advice. Number 2, separate out the acknowledgement and action. You can acknowledge somebody giving the advice without deciding about acting on it, or that acknowledgement means you're going to take action from it. And 3 is when you go to acknowledge it, you find one positive element, even if the bare minimum is that you appreciate them sharing their story, their tip with you. And number 4 is you don't need to explain your decision immediately. You don't need to explain your decision if you're going to do something else or if you agree with them. There is no rush. There's no need to do that and explain yourself. And that is the very first episode of Verbal Judo. I am looking forward to episode 115. I'll check back with you next week.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.